Hey, what's up, guys? It's your boy Days, and you're about to watch Thorin rant for about 3 hours.
I'm back for another edition of my monthly Patreon video AMA. This one is going to be catching up on some of the questions left over from the last one, and we'll maybe take in some from the most recent one. And then this very same week, you will actually see a second edition to start the next month out. So Barbara Stanwyck's Legs had a question in the last Patreon AMA that actually, turns out I misread the end part of it. When this person was asking about Thresh, the legendary Quake dueler, he was asking how would this person do in the modern Quake world scene? As in, if I go and I put him up against great players of different eras. Def is obviously a classic one in the modern day. Milton is considered the GOAT. And so, yeah, I mean, in terms of like the difference between NetQuake and Quake world, the big problem is, like, listen, in Thresh's era, movement wasn't really that big a thing anyway. Like, people weren't really like bunny hopping around in NetQuake that much. So the big issue is you don't know how good his movement would be. And I do actually think that fluid movement makes a difference in Quake world. So I don't know how he would fare in that regard. He was never a guy who had like craziest mechanics anyway. In terms of playing people like Milton, Def, etc., one of the main problems I always thought with Quake world, and this is one of the reasons I don't think it was an appropriate 1v1 game, is especially when they took away weapon control, which, by the way, was one of the things that Thresh showed us in the match against Entropy, for example, the Red Annihilation match. When you take that component away and everyone can just get the gun when they run over it, it becomes more about like weapon, ammo, hoarding, etc. I actually found that not to be as interesting personally. I know it's because people didn't want someone to just have a stranglehold in the map the whole time, but I thought that chess element was what made the game better, actually. So for me, a lot of the modern day great players happened to be good in 1v1 as well. Obviously, Paradox could be pretty good, but they were never really specializing in it in the way Thresh was. And for me, it's the fact that their skills were just that good. Like, one thing I actually hated about watching Def play is there were times towards the latter part of his career, especially on LAN, where it felt like he just didn't want to lose the game. So he just played what he called Counter-Strike style. What Griffin would obviously do, where you just plus back all the time. I find that makes games rubbish, especially on the likes of DM4. Like, it just ruins the map. That's a map for going really fast and just seeing who at the end. It's like having a basketball shootout. Let's see who can hit the most shots at the end. If you're just going to camp like that upper area or never come out of the lower mega health or whatever it is, I mean, it just kind of makes for a bad viewing experience. So I think he wouldn't have much of a chance, quite frankly. I don't know that I've ever seen anything to suggest that Thresh had the modern day skills. He had the brain, certainly, but it's very rare that you have someone, I would say the best example ever is Cooler, who actually he didn't even have the best raw mechanics and skills back in Quake 3. But then you come along to Quake Live, like talking 6 years later in certain cases, and the guy actually had some of the best skills in the whole world in the game in terms of gunplay. So I thought that was incredible that he somehow was able to level up in that regard. I don't know that a lot of the old school people would do it. Now, Bobby says, if Team Liquid and EG made a single roster move tomorrow and they would be able to replace that person with whoever they wanted, who do you think would be replaced and which player would they pick up? Right, now this is actually the question I was referencing in the last episode because I thought I'd get to it, but it was a pretty long episode. In terms of like potential roster moves. Now, the key thing here is the way he's worded it, which is if they made a single roster move and they would be able to replace that person with whoever they wanted, so who they would want. I'm not going with who I want or who could just replace, because listen, the obvious example would be almost any team just put simple instead of whoever you like, and yeah, it seems unlikely the team would be worse. So in terms of who I would suggest they might pick up, that's an interesting question, because I have to try and think of the psychology of the Team Liquid and the EG players. I think for both teams, there's got to be a chance they would consider Automatic, as bizarre as it sounds. I don't think his current form deserves it whatsoever, and he hasn't done anything to prove that he should be in either of these teams. But you think about the connections some of the players have with him in the past, or have respected him in the past. He obviously was an extremely good player for a couple of years in NA. I think he would have to be considered somebody you could pick up, especially for my money, with the fact that you don't have to make this guy one of the stars of the team. He's certainly shown he'll play lesser roles. Obviously, actually, you know what? In a team like Team Liquid, I don't even mind him being the AWP. Like, if you have a varied team where now the AWPers are going to be Stewie at certain times, mainly CT, Automatic certain sites on CT, and then I'd probably take out Nitro, quite frankly. But, NAF obviously can do it a little bit. I think that's actually a better approach to AWPing for Team Liquid. So I think Automatic wouldn't be a bad pick up there. I hope, personally, they wouldn't just pick up a young stud. I don't think it makes any sense for either of these teams. You've got your bevy of stars. I think let me see. The obvious one that it just feels like would be a cultural fit would be that if EG decided to cut someone, the problem is it's probably going to be Tarek at this point in time, which I don't think makes that much sense in terms of roles. And I don't think they're going to be willing to cut Ethan, and he's the one of the big trio that I've never really been in on as a star. So I would personally like, if this move was available, if EG added NAF, I feel like he would really add like an extra clutch factor to their team. I think he's quite a unique player. I think he could take actually some of the things that Tarek has to do, some of the dirty work for the team. And I think his ethos just fits EG as a squad better, in my opinion. Obviously, he's played with Tarek in the past, etc. It depends if he would be replacing Tarek in this case. I would replace Ethan with him. I'd see what you do with that mix. You could also then do certain double op setups, depending on the maps he likes to. I think that would just be a fun little dynamic to set up. On the Team Liquid side, though, if it's not Automatic, would they pick up a younger player, I wonder? I mean, I personally, if he'd stuck with the game, would have liked to have seen them give Wardell a try. I feel like actually his style of play, if they convinced him not to bait, which he sometimes did in August, I think he could have been a very powerful player on that team, and it wouldn't even matter that he dies a lot as well. Like, the raw firepower would make that team really crazy. Who else could we consider for this one? I want to give one more name, maybe. Would you pick anyone up out of the newer players? That's the problem. People are going to say, like, what about Graham? So he never played a LAN as far as I'm concerned, like a real LAN with a real team. So I wouldn't take him to a top team. I'd let someone else pick him up. Think about how things work in Europe. Astralis doesn't just go, under normal circumstances, they just pick up, like, they don't go and pick up Tessis, do they? What they do is they say, you know what, right, North or Heroic can pick up Tessis, or Mad Lions or someone, prove that he works, show it against Tier 1, and then we'll go and dive in and get him. So, similarly, I don't think Team Liquid or EG should be the ones going into the complete wilderness. Like, I've seen Wardell play enough on LAN that I feel like he could do it. I also think, actually, the style of play in Team Liquid would suit him a lot more. Maybe one more name for EG. Thinking who's available, if you could take someone out of Cloud9. Actually, you know what? I wouldn't hate it if you replaced Ethan with Floppy. I think that might actually be an interesting matchup. I think actually that of the two players right now, listen, Ethan certainly had some very good LAN tournaments last year, and Floppy hasn't had enough experience in that regard, so I can't give him the edge in that regard. But if I just look with the eye test, I think Floppy's really proven himself in this Cloud9 lineup recently and probably deserves to be on a better squad, or at least if Cloud9 makes their team better, maybe to be on that squad. So in terms of, who would we replace? I think Nitro's got to be on the chopping block. Don't really know that you can replace any of the others except maybe NAF for attitude if he just chooses not, maybe he just doesn't want to play as much. I don't know, it's pure speculation. 3G, it's got to surely be Tarek or Ethan. People are going to say Stanislaw, but I would say again, who are you putting instead of him? Like, is JDubs coming back? FNS is really sort of in the wilderness, right? I don't really know who you replace him with at that point in time. I'd like it. Listen, I'll tell you what would be a baller move, in my opinion, is either Team Liquid or EG just goes, pulls out the checkbook, right, $600,000 on a check, or just has a GM with skills and gets it down to 450k or whatever, and signs Alex. Why not do that move? This guy can frag a little bit. He's worked with some very strong players. Now you're giving a whole bevy of star players in either team. He's also a guy who speaks fluent English, obviously, and he's willing to live in North America. Now, listen, he did want to play in Flashpoint. That's a problem, but you know what? Make him an offer he can't refuse. I think there's a pretty cool one for either team, quite frankly, if they want to change the IGLs out, just thinking of the style of these teams. I also think, quite frankly, if you see what he did with Ziwu in Vitality, I'd love to see what he would do with Cirque in EG. I feel like he could be the guy to make Cirque like a top 5 player in the world. I Am 24 asks, as I didn't watch CS 1.6 or CS Source, but want to know how players compare, can you tell me who had the highest peak in skill? Would it be simple, or did players like Markelov have a higher peak? Right, obviously we're talking the difference between absolute and relative here, because as the game develops, say with every sport, quite frankly. I would say generally the highest skill peak is going to be the more recent player overall. Like they can learn from the moves of the people in the past. In the case of Counter-Strike, they get better equipment, better mouse pads, better mice, better drivers even. In theory, the monitor's got more frames per second. Like there's all sorts of things that we have that would upgrade it in that sense. So I would say we're talking like relative skill peak here, because yes, I would say Simple's the highest skill peak of any player ever in Counter-Strike. So if you want to talk about relative skill peak though, like who had the highest, well, the interesting thing is Simple is absurdly skilled, but he exists in the era of Nico and then, you know, a whole bunch of other really skilled players as well. Markelov, like to me, I think 1.6 allowed you actually to express more skill individually. I think you had more control. You could dodge more. You could hit no scopes cleaner. I think actually the spray was better. The pistols could be aimed accurately. You didn't have to sort of spam and half move half the time. I think there was actually ways in which the skill peak could be very high in 1.6. So the problem is, Markelov was certainly one of the most skilled players. He was right up there. He was a contender for that title. But he played in a time with Forrest. Now, I thought Forrest sometimes probably gets a little bit overrated for his skill because he didn't manifest all the time. Like, the difference is Michael Jordan did that stuff for like every game. Like Forrest really didn't. But he certainly was absurd when he was on. Probably had the highest. We often say in 1.6 he had the highest skill peak. I wouldn't be against that as a principle. I think other players you'd have to look at who had extremely high skill peaks. I mean, this is a little bit more specialized because it's mainly with the AWP, but you'd have to say Kogu. That guy was absolutely incredible as an AWPer. I thought Trace had a very high skill level across the board with the weapons he used. It's hard to say about Neo because Neo also seemed to have that feel for the game, which I think made a lot of his kills. It wasn't like the craziest raw single bullet aim type scenario. So maybe, I mean, Edward had an extremely high skill level, Markelov's teammate in that regard. Incredible spray, unbelievably good pistols. He's going to be a very skilled player. If you want to go with another player, maybe like Real from Norway. And it looked so natural with him because he's a guy who didn't spend a lot of years putting in loads of time. Could just be absurd how skilled this guy was. So yeah, I think there's some pretty good picks. And so how would they compare? Yeah, you could compare a Markelov or a Forrest in that time to what Simple and Nico are doing now. I don't really know about the whole higher or lower angle. Like higher peak, again, what are you measuring? It's just the eye test, isn't it? So I'd say he was extremely skilled at that game, but CSGO's been out long enough, Simple's extremely skilled at this game. I actually think the way Simple is skilled at this game seems more impossible to me than actually the 1.6 players who are really great in that regard. Spencer Green says, is there a lack of community support for CSGO content creators that aren't run-of-the-mill YouTubers / streamers, or is there simply a lack of legitimate, serious CSGO content akin to yours, Richard's, DK's at the moment? Am I oversimplifying this issue possibly? Any other content, any other creators or sites I'm missing or I should be looking out for? Right, there is a lack of community support because the big problem at the moment is people right now have to just follow the methods that the other content creators like myself made popular to become successful and get hits on your content. And the problem is at the moment that involves having a social media presence, putting it on Reddit, and then hoping it succeeds in either domain. The problem with that is that then is dependent on purely popularity issues, basically. It's not about how good the content is. So I would say even for me, you sometimes see some of my content just bizarrely downvoted, not given much attention. And if I was going purely for hits and raw ad revenue, that could be discouraging, certainly. Yeah, that might even convince you not to try a certain piece of content. So I can't really even imagine for really small content creators what it must be like. Like I see some content out there that's even got big names involved with it that's getting like 1,000 or less views a month. So I think people don't realize how letting sort of the reply guys take over Reddit and stuff like that has sort of, it's not even about the quality. It's diminished the sheer amount of content. So as a result, by ratio, you will not get the quality that you want. I mean, people like me, I'm doing it for my own reasons, but people will soon find out. If I ever stop caring one day, I'll just be gone. There'll just be nothing from me. And then everyone who wanted to talk shit but still secretly watch the content, which is a decent amount of people, then they'll be left with nothing. But you know what? That's probably what they'll deserve. So what I would say is, there is a lack of serious stuff because the people who are smaller than me, basically I make my content big by having my own personality, which has its own separate elements attached to it, which remain relevant. And that ensures that my content has an extra oomph to it, has a name brand value you click on that you know from the past. A lot of really good up and coming content creators don't have that. And so I see their content. I put it on Reddit myself. Sometimes it gets downvoted. The first 4 or 5 comments are just horrible comments. People being shitty to them, acting like they know better than them, as though like it was a crime to put forward some cool content outlining a strat. I mean, there's a whole bunch of people have seen. Obviously, back in the day, Elmer Poddy's one of the few people who got through the kind of filter, probably because he had actually charisma. But I would say people like Alan Hender, I think, has done a really good job. Like Hawker sometimes does a good job outlining strats. There's a new guy, Natu, who does some stuff, not to be confused with Natu from ENCE, obviously. There's a few different people out there who are putting out these videos. It's just that people on Reddit don't seem to really care. It's why you know that it's fake when they pretend like, I only want analysts to do strats and break it down really in depth. You don't reward that content. It's pretty simple. And these aren't people, by the way, with contentious personalities, do anything to not. No, people just see their work, and people who think they know it all just go, I'm just going to downvote this because fuck this guy. How dare he have content when I'm just a guy that nobody acknowledges who posts Reddit comments. So that's just the world we live in. I mean, for myself, I've already got plans, I won't reveal them right now, to move away from this particular model into a very specific direction that will essentially, I hope, get around some of the algorithms, get around silly popularity contests, and allow people to directly connect with me to get the content. So let's see if I can actually execute upon that. I won't say more until I'm in a position where I can. Jake Rizika says, in your video on the Fnatic Envy era, right, this is from a while ago, it was over a year and a half ago, it seems I'd said at the time I still considered the Fnatic team to be the best of all time over Astralis. So he wanted to know back when he did this question originally, what Astralis would have had to do to overcome that. And then he caught up and replied and said that he's now seen that I call Astralis the best team of all time. So he wants to know, when do I think they overtook Fnatic, and what did they have to do? Right, the key thing is, personally, I've always had a different take on the Fnatic era than most people. Like, the reason to me it was originally going to be the Fnatic Envy era is that Envy sort of stole some of the big moments that Fnatic needed to solidify the era within the early months of 2015, which is, if Fnatic had won Dream that winter, which I think they would have, I mean, they were never eliminated in a best of 3, they forfeit, and if they'd have won MLG X Games Aspen, which, I mean, they were extremely close to winning the semis against NIP, and I would have loved to see that game against Envy. They nearly always got that Envy line. In fact, they always did on LAN. So if they win those 2 tournaments, I think you can already see that's an era right then. That would have been something like, 5 LANs in a row? I mean, 6 if you count ESEA. They would have been top 4 every LAN they'd ever played at. They would have won a major already. That would already be in contention for an era. So I already would have had it. So to me, what I did was, when Envy won the other tournaments, but then Fnatic came right back and became a champion again, I've often connected those two and thought that it was reasonable to make that a long era. Yeah, it can be contentious. If not, then you're making the era basically Katowice, well, the tournament before that, what's it called? Pantamera, Katowice and on, and then you go until they get dethroned in Cluj, which to me is not as cool an era. So if you're looking at the overall what I would count, you're probably talking about something like 15 tournaments won. Sure, like 1 or 2 was smaller or exhibition type tournaments. So we're talking about like 2 majors. You're also in the playoffs of 2 more majors. You won a whole bunch of tournaments, let's say 7, 8 legit tournaments. So a couple of majors, 7, 8 legit tournaments, loads of top 4s, loads of top 8s. Like, that's the sort of thing that establishes the best era ever. So what would Astralis have to have done to overtake that? Well, if we go back and look, when Astralis won their first major, Face It Major London, with this lineup, that was when all they'd won, I'm going to say all, because we're talking contrasted against the greatest team of all time, was they'd won Dream Masters Marseille, second at IEM Sydney, they'd won Pro League 7, ECS Season 5, top 4 at Cologne, they won CSGO Premier, Stockholm second, and then they won the major. So I think I had 3 tournaments they didn't win there. So we're coming down to like 5 wins in a major, plus relevant in all the others. Like, that's enough for an era, maybe. We could debate that. I think that might be enough for an era if you look overall. Not as long a span of time, but they certainly won a lot of matches. Back then, that was when they very rarely ever got double-digit rounds scored against them. So even on except when the opponent would win the map, obviously. So I would say if you go a little bit further beyond that, then they won a Blast Pro Series, but a very weak one. No one cares about that. But then they won IEM Chicago, Okay, it was getting interesting already. Then they won ECS Season 6. So that's already 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That's 7 titles. I think, let me have a look. Was that including the major? Yeah, that's including the major. 7 titles, including the major. That's still not as good as 2 majors and that. But again, obviously, we have to quantify each of the majors. So how about this? How about when they win the Grand Slam, which was when they won ESL Pro League Season 8. So that would have been 7 titles and a major and some second places and top 4s at literally everything. I think that already was enough because look at the dominance. Look at who they're beating. They have no true rival. They've beaten everyone. They've won the major. They've won the Grand Slam, which is an accomplishment. They've won back-to-back online seasons into LAN finals. Held those titles simultaneously. They won a bunch of blasts along the way. I think that actually might be enough. I think iTest also would say that they were incredible. Their map pool is amazing, innovative, utility usage. I think that would already be enough. So what they actually did the next year, winning the next major and adding some more blasting, I mean, that was actually overkill, if anything. I don't think they even needed the 3rd major either. It's not about how many majors you won overall. I think that in itself is actually very impressive. But okay, worst case scenario, just say up until the next major, if you don't like that. 2 majors and then all they've done. I think that's enough at that point in time. Fnatic also used to get their ass handed to them by the Astralis core back in that day. So actually, Astralis did have a very legit rival who was... Fnatic did have a very legit rival who was beating them quite regularly back in 2015. A crunchy captain says, you have often said the CS majors should always go and get the absolute best talent in the scene and that industry politics and penny pinching shouldn't get in the way. If given the job to hire the talent for the next major, what would be your current dream team for the desk? Right, so he means just the desk. I'm not picking commentators, etc. At least I assume so. If you say desk there, I'm taking it to mean the analysis desk. So first and foremost, right out the gate, it's got to be Machine as the host. I know now he does a lot of commentary, but I still think he's at his best as a host. And even though it took me a while to warm up to his angle where he's trying to be the star as well and trying to flex his personality and do some kind of fun vocal and word imagery things. I think actually, first of all, he's got a lot better at it. He's attuned it and aligned it with the premise and theme of the events a lot better. And also, I think I've just gotten used to it a lot more myself anyway and seen kind of the benefit of it. So I think actually he's the current best host overall and would just be the best all around and adds the extra professional sheen on top. I would also hire Richard as a host and I would have them share the role, but I would have Richard be the guy who's more the relief host in that regard because I want him to be part of the major. I think he can definitely do a very good job. He's a very professional host and one of the best at handling tech problems, etc. Actually might even be the best in the industry. Oftentimes I wouldn't even know sometimes when he had tech problems and I would just keep filling myself and then find out later they were going mental in his ears. So I would say they're my hosts. With the current state of the scene, it has to be Sponge as the main analyst because in my opinion, he's either number 1 or if you're somebody who likes my style, 1A, 1B. I think that's fair except I don't do as many events as him, so I'll give him the title. For me, he's the best at the moment, so I've got to hire him. Does the best all around in terms of the job. I even think you've seen him expand his skill set because he has different partners on different shows. Then in terms of analysts, obviously I would be there as an analyst more for the historical narrative side. I like a larger crew of analysts, but to rotate, I like to only have 2 on the desk at once. I don't mind for majors, for the major finals, if you want 3 to get everyone on there, that's fair enough. But I would go with, at the moment, my favourite analysts after that are Maui Snake and Maniac, but Maui Snake hasn't been blooded on the big tournaments yet. So I would hire him to this event, but I would hire him in more of a junior role and work him in. So I would put Maniac as my next best. I think actually I see him every 3 months. It seems like he takes a jump up a level. He's always got the professional sheen, but he's finally starting to kind of figure out, basically, if you notice what people try to like about him, is they like when he does those moments where, this is why I always tell him to be the professor of Counter-Strike, where he's sort of teaching a moment about the game, but it's about his enthusiasm for that player or that moment and applying a general principle of the game and then tying it into what they're doing and why it's wonderful. So I think he's probably one of the best at selling players and what they're brilliant at. You can look at how he's talked about art recently from Fury. I think that's made a big impact on people. So I would absolutely hire him as my next analyst. Maui Snake. And then, let me see, who else would I want after that? Because after that, I feel there's a lot of people you could hire. Like, it depends who my casters are. Because, for example, if I don't have Launders as a caster on the event itself, I would want him as an analyst, actually. I've always thought he was a very good analyst. I think he's pretty suited for the desk. I think in time, he's even started to develop a little bit of banter. He was very dry when he started out, but I think he could be a top analyst who could work on a major. I think I would just pick that as my team for now. I think that's a pretty good squad of people. I like all the people working there. There's a lot of people I like otherwise, but these are the people I would pick if it was my dream team, and I'm picking them based on my own reasons. Hands on Keyboard says, "Hi Thorin, I've been watching people talk on Twitter about top 5 best LOL players, top 5 ADC recently due to Uzi I's retirement. I was thinking back to your top 20 article in 2015 and Frost's half-finished one near a similar time. What are your main criteria for rating players in LOL, and has your opinion changed over criteria you possibly overrated in the past, or maybe something that was underappreciated that move up in your priorities?" Yes. If you actually saw, I did a 3-part series recently on the greatest Western League of Legends player of all time. And so in part 1, I explain who the candidates are. Part 2, I have like 6 criteria categories and I explain them and I rank these players based on it, and then I give them an overall grade. And then part 3 is like a professional overview of the 16 players in their order and what made them brilliant. So one of the things I did in doing so is, in the past, I myself also, I think, gave too much credence to team results, but so much of that is not in the control of the player, and so you're sort of crediting him for something he didn't do. Like, I'll give you an example. This is a fact someone can go and look up. If anyone ever wants to have a quarterback debate with you and talk about who the greatest quarterback is, just tell them this fact. Tom Brady has the most championship rings of any NFL quarterback ever. He won 0 of those quarterback NFL championship Super Bowl rings without a top 8 ranked defense in the league. Now, Tom Brady does not play on defense. He does not recruit players for defense. He has nothing to do with defense except how much time they are on the field. That is it. So essentially, an area of the game he had nothing to do with is one of the most consistent factors in him winning. So basically, he can't do his job to win unless someone else does an incredible job in another area of the game. Now, if you don't then apply those factors to the other quarterbacks in the conversation, not only, in my opinion, is it an unfair and a disingenuous conversation, it actually has not very much value to it. Like, you've used too limited amount of factor analysis. So what I would say is, I've taken a lot of team elements out of it, but I tried to find individual qualities that fit more. So eye test, I think, should be number 1. I like the idea of longevity of play, but only peak years, how many years you're at a world-class level. Let's not, like, you can't just mail in 10 extra years as like the 3rd best mid laner in LCS and then beat out Expeke, who retired years ago, but had an exceptional level of play at his peak. It's about how many years you're at your peak. So I would say those are the factors. Like, I think longevity is way overrated by most people. Teamwork success is absurdly overrated. It is literally the bottleneck for most people on these lists. And I also think that people don't get enough credit when they had weaker players and they perform well. You certainly shouldn't like boost ahead of the guy with the best team, but you should get like certain times consideration for that. So I've already basically go and watch those videos if you want to see it, but it's something I'll be applying heavily in the future to other games, including CS, and maybe I'll do a real League of Legends, like top 10 players ever type list. We'll see. Scott K says, in a parallel universe where one change didn't happen or a potential change that didn't happen actually occurred to the game, which one change do you think would have changed which players, too many times using the word change here, changed which team/players dominated the most, e.g. Kenny/JW and the AWP nerf, right? I'm going to go ahead and burst a balloon for some people here. The AWP nerf isn't what killed JW. JW's game had already fallen off heavily. He wasn't half as effective long before the AWP nerf. Months and months before the AWP nerf. So what I would say in that sense is JW's style of play would have never allowed him to be consistent. It's like when Pawn was considered one of the best mid laners in 2014 in League of Legends. That style of play is just not going to be maintainable. You're not going to be able to do it reliably. And actually other teams are going to figure out certain trigger points in your mechanisms for how you get that off that are going to ruin it. So I would just say, I don't think JW is it. I think Kenny S, certainly, the AWP nerf was a big deal. His motivation had already fallen off because of his teammates. So I don't know if it would have been the big deal then. But put it this way, if you don't change that AWP nerf, which I still think was way too heavy, I would like it to be halfway between where it is and where it was before. Imagine what Simple would be like now. I already think Simple is the most unstoppable player. He's the only player where he's the one who has to stop himself. Even people like Nico, you can neutralize to some degree. Even Device, you can maybe get to and touch him up a little bit in the context of like old defense against some of the great players. The problem is, I actually think that Simple with the AWP, the way that it was before the AWP nerf, would be like Prime Wilt Chamberlain. Nobody ever stopped Prime Wilt Chamberlain. If you're going to think Bill Russell did, I'd suggest you go and look at their matchups individually and what Wilt Chamberlain was still doing. Nobody ever stopped Wilt Chamberlain. They maybe slowed him a step. That's about it. He stopped himself occasionally, but the guy, I mean, he rarely did. Like, look at the numbers, look at the performances, look at the times he carried teams with way worse players, way less all-stars. Like, the guy was a god. And in similar fashion, I think Simple's already unstoppable, so I can't even imagine how dominant he would be right now. He probably could already win majors, even with the current lineups that Navi's had, and if they weren't in great form. So I think that's a fairly obvious one. In terms of a change didn't happen, I also think thank everything, goodness, the Lord, whatever, for that CZ nerf over the years. Because if you had the original CZ from late 2014, I mean, for example, the classic FaZe Clan lineup, I think they would have an era. I think if you look at teams like Team Liquid, Astralis would have had a very hard time coming back to knock them off. Who else? The French Super Team would have been pretty fun. G2 2017. I think they could have been way more dangerous, won way more tournaments. Like, you would have just seen some bonkers, skilled, loose style teams dominating tournaments. Because already the CZ and the Deagle have been good since then. Spoonfed 89. You've mentioned a few times that you'd make the video, but since you haven't yet, perhaps you can give the Cliff Notes version of why you give teams 3 to 4 events after a change before deciding on their level. Right, basically, it's because, first of all, you can often play your first LAN or 2 even immediately after getting the player, maybe a week later, 2 weeks later, where you haven't had time to properly practice. Maybe you don't even have time to practice between the tournaments. So that first tournament, sometimes it goes amazing and you win. Actually, sometimes you overperform. I would still look at like SK 2009 when they beat Fnatic when they got Crystal and Face into the team, but then weren't the number one team. I think you can also be dreadful immediately. I think you could point to the guys in G2 actually, how they performed. I mean, they went to a lot of those tournaments in a row almost, so maybe their 3 to 4 should have been like 6 to 7. But basically, you haven't had time to properly blood the team in. After 3 or 4, you're probably going to have had like a bad tournament, then an alright one. Like, you can't have had just the worst matchups ever in all these tournaments. What are the odds over 4 tournaments? So by about 4 tournaments, you should have a sense for like what peak performance would be like, even if not for a whole tournament, for matches, to see what they're capable of. And I would say it's rare that beyond that, like 2.5 months into the lineup or 7 lands in, suddenly the team peaks with an incredible level. I think you've seen that on rare occasions like Mouse Sports this lineup, G2 this lineup, but other than that, it's very rare that that ever happens. Usually you know within 3 or 4 lands or say 2 months where the team's at. So there's the Cliff Notes version. Like you say, it's a video I intend to do and I would go in a lot more depth and laterally think up a lot more possible reasons there as well. The NA Kerfuffle says, greetings, Thorin. So my question to you is the following. Do you think there will be ever a head coach for TSM that doesn't get kneecapped by the TSM mafia? Or has the stigma become so bad that potential coaches just avoid it like the plague? Right, based on what I've heard, it sounds like they don't even go after the biggest coaches. So I would suggest Reginald is doing that thing again where, because you in theory have final say, you just have to insert some opinion of your own into the equation, even when it doesn't necessarily make sense to. So, like the person they were supposed to be signing in the off-season, I don't know if it's ever been leaked, but I thought that was pathetic. Like it was a Korean coach who's coached in the LPL, I'll just say that. And to me, like, I get why they thought he was good in the LPL, but I don't know why they thought it would work on TSM, a team that, by the way, didn't even have any Koreans. So I don't know what they were thinking with that move. I guess they were just looking at Team Liquid and Cloud9 and going, they have Korean coaches, which is there's nothing innovative about that, by the way, Reginald. So I would say, I don't think, based on what I've heard, there will ever be head coaches who properly get a full year of their plan, their players, their system, their coaching style, regardless of results, and then at the end, get judged on that and hired or fired. I think the big problem is Reginald will always step in. I would even speculate the reason why Path is the head coach is to be the Jason Garrett to Reginald's Jerry Jones and just do whatever Reginald wants, just directly in this case, instead of Reginald having to come in for playoffs or come in when the team's got a bad record and shout at people and do things that sometimes work, but with certain other personalities seem to piss them off, actually. I mean, just look at the way people like Sven has spoken about TSM since they've left. Some of these guys didn't appreciate the way they were coached, I get a feeling. So I actually also think a lot of top coaches, as famously Zix himself said, they know that you get treated like shit if you're in TSM, so they don't want to join that team. That's why, to me, the dumbest move from TSM ever was not to pick up Youngbuck when I told him in the offseason. I'm pretty sure he would have said yes. I think he would have joined the team and he would have had one of the best band-aid/problem solvers in the entire world working on your quite flawed TSM lineups that need exactly that. And I think if you just look at the way he's worked with stars in his teams, Perks and Sven, Caps and Reckless, even more recently, you could say Nemesis and Reckless. Like, this guy knows how to make the stars work. So I think he could get way more out of Bjergsen and now Doublelift, or Bjergsen and Kobe if it'd been the last lineup, than the other coaches did. So I think it's craziness. But this is one of the flaws of TSM. There's certain things they've done very well, and then they just iterate that forever and never upgrade their formula otherwise. Blaster 2000 says, what is your opinion on turning Spring Split into a best-of-5 double elimination tournament with seeding based on summer split season results? Even if a team gets eliminated, that would make them an ideal practice partner. Additionally, it would be a way for Riot to test out a double elimination format without much risk. Secondly, get rid of Rift rivals and create a pre-Worlds regional tournament, East and West, with the results determining seeding for Worlds. The lower tier regions can compete in the regional tournament, and we can skip play in a play-in stage and move directly into the main event. I kind of like the idea of having a regional winner, something that is a lower tier than a world championship, but is still significant and meaningful, almost like a stepping stone to the world title. I actually like most of these suggestions. Like, I've always thought Spring Split, I actually thought LCS personally should in general be a tournament circuit that even has series in the name. And then if you want a split like a league, have that be the summer split and lead in the world. So yeah, I like that idea, double elim. I even think you could make it smaller and have one double elim and then one that's like GSL groups in with single elim. Just have like a couple of tournaments that like let people warm up in the spring and even test out different rosters and players, figure out if they got the right one. Then they go into summer with the real roster, the real coaching staff, and there's less like uncertainty from off season. So I like that angle. Then I'll also say I like the idea of getting rid of Rift rivals and having a regional tournament, like as you say, East and West. So you'd have like an MSC type tournament. You'd have like a Rift rivals Europe, but it would an NA, but it would be a tournament. I like the angle as well. Not only is it another title to compete for, like as well as being the champion of my region, I could be the champion of the West. Which, by the way, imagine if like Team Liquid had won that last year somehow. That, like maybe Fnatic beats G2 and then Team Liquid beats Fnatic. That would be amazing if they could have said, we're not only the NA champions, but we're also the Western champions. And then, yeah, we didn't do as well at Worlds. It's another thing to compete for. I like that. But I especially like the idea that it determines the seeding for Worlds and lets the lesser teams play. Gives them something to play for. Maybe it can even be how they qualify, whereas some of the other teams qualify from their regions. But I like the seeding idea because then we're not left in a scenario where we have to act like second seed from Europe is the same as NA every time. No, maybe this tournament can determine. Yeah, I think generally, I don't have that much to add. I think you've done a good job there laying out some different possibilities that have a coherent logic behind them and seem to fit into an overall tournament circuit that adds things we want, takes away things we generally don't want, and actually makes even Worlds itself stronger, because I think the playing part's just gubbins, isn't it? I think it's just garbage. Barbara Stanwick's legs. Which esports figures contend with Rafa for getting the most out of their abilities / overachieving? Right, this is actually an easy one for me to answer because basically I'm picking out people where they were champions or extremely good, but I don't think they had like the craziest skills. Like I don't think their raw talent or potential meant they had to be a champion or even a great player. So obvious examples would be Flash. Like, Flash had very good mechanics in the StarCraft sense, but in terms of raw APM, he was nowhere near the greatest players. He was even better Terran players than him, and definitely some Protoss players like Best who were way above his level, and Bisu. So I think Flash has got to be one, because let's face it, he's probably the GOAT of all time of any esports game, and as far as I can tell, didn't even have close to the best skills in StarCraft. You've got to look at like two other big names from StarCraft Brood War would be I Love Uve, an insane macro monster, but I'd actually quite shit micro at times. I think Savior considering, again, the guy wasn't doing it with high APM. He was just a genius. He was kind of like, he was one of the closest analogs I'd have for Rafa. The way he set up traps, the way he tricked his opponents. I think he was just incredible the way moment to moment in the game he adapted. And listen, that guy left some championships on the table, guys. Every championship he lost in the finals, he could have won. This guy really could have had, I think, 7 championships. He could have had the most in history. Now, listen, a lot of other people have ones where they could say that, but his more so than any others. Like, he was that brilliant, in my opinion. In the more modern day, I'd say Stork. I always thought Stork was a guy who played off a mixture of heart, preparation, and like a very good rational sense for the game, which is why I think if you tilted or triggered him, much like Device and Counter-Strike, you could throw him off, because then he's second-guessing himself, he's overthinking. I think that's where like rationality can work against you. It can kind of destroy who you are in that sense. Who else should we pick out for this one? Thresh is an obvious one, who got the absolute most out of his skill set. Cooler. I don't think Cooler could have done much more. He could have been a much worse player. Could have just been a very good player. Let's see. What about Counter-Strike? Getright's an obvious example. Getright's a guy who had the skill set to be like a top 20 player of all time. And for my money, he's probably a top 5 player of all time in Counter-Strike 1.6. And a lot of people have heard this opinion before. I genuinely think if Counter-Strike 1.6 lasted 3 or 4 more years, I could have made the case for him being the GOAT. Easily one that, along with Neo, probably the most consistent Counter-Strike player ever. Any version. Unbelievable what his body of work over early CSGO and the end of 1.6, the guy legitimately might have put together a stretch of like 6 years as a top 5 player in the world. I'm talking better than what Device has done in CSGO. And for some of those years, by the way, he was number 1 in a way that Device wasn't. So Getright's got to be up there. I mean, the funny thing is when you say overachieving, a lot of these guys are overachieving, but the problem is, like, for example, I always thought Element got a lot out of his ability, but he underachieved. Like, as BSL famously said in his article, like, this guy could have won, he maybe won 5 world championships, he could have won like 10. Like, this guy, it's like Kobe in the NBA, where they could have had a lot more rings if certain things had gone in other ways, if they'd have zigged when they could have zagged, or when they did zag. So yeah, there's a few key names. So maybe I'll pick out one more for you and make it a little bit more obscure, maybe. Maybe think I'll give you a League of Legends one or two, shall I? I think I've got to say Score. Because even though he didn't overachieve, he could have won many more championships. To be that good for that long and in your off-roll jungle is unbelievable. Like, to me, that's like he already had a very smart brain. He already was doing some shot calling from ADC, but he just took it to another level. Like, got to have one of the shrewdest insights to League of Legends, the way the game played out, probably ever in the history of the game. There's one for you. Soliko. If esports never came to be, what would your career be? Right, I've mentioned this a few times before, but I'll do a different version on it. That's, by the way, there's a little trick for anyone out there. If you ever have to do multiple interviews, multiple questions, what you do is you start from the same premise, which is what happened, not the truth or your opinion, but you just rephrase it a different way each time. And sometimes even in doing so, you find a different angle on it you didn't think of before. So I often say I would have liked to have been a comic book writer. That's because I actually find the medium quite interesting. I think it's a very unexplored medium, which is one of the reasons I find Alan Moore's work so fascinating. I think he does a lot of things that other people haven't even started to scratch the surface on. A couple of other careers I could have seen myself doing, though. I also would have liked to have been the writer of a comic strip, but I'm talking like a 3-panel one like you would have had in the newspaper back in the day, but online. So I used to like Sinfest. I mean, for obvious reasons, not a big fan of it in the latter years. I haven't bothered reading it, but I thought for a number of years that was quite a fun comic. XCD or whatever the fuck that one was called. It used to be fun. That also, unfortunately, got ruined by politics, basically. The Art of Geek, was it called, or something like that? There was like that famous one that was like, it was mainly like nerd stuff, like it was about like Apple and fucking Steve Jobs or whatever, you know. But that used to be quite fun from a tech angle. I would like to have done one of those, but I actually think what would be fun is maybe to do an esports angle. Listen, you're saying if esports never came to be, so maybe I would just stick to pop culture, or I would just go with fun, like characters from comics, things from movies, and do your own fun endings on them, or commentary on them. Like obviously now you do a Last of Us Part 2 ending commentary or something, you know, or how underwhelming it is or whatever. So I think that would be a fun one. And then another thing I would have to suggest is, just from actually what I've learned from doing his esports, I actually think if I look back, even on subjects I found interesting, it's got maybe being a historian. I think I'm a kind of guy who I like to research things for myself and find out the context for myself. And then once I have my context, I like to be able to put it out there so someone can come join me on the journey. So they have to take someone else's context, which is often second or third hand, and in the case of historians, referenced elsewhere. I'd be the guy who goes to the primary sources and tries to download the whole history of this area and then write my own book on that topic. Could compare it to when Colin Wilson did his criminal history of mankind or whatever, that kind of approach. I could have seen myself going down that route as well. Spoonfed89. With both the French teams seeming to have found good coaches, what team would you like to see Existence join? Just because you have a good coach, by the way, doesn't, in my opinion, mean you don't change him. I mean, this is one thing that's bizarre. Just as with players, listen, just because your team's 10th best in the world doesn't mean you don't need to upgrade. That's why I'm actually very impressed with Mad Lions taking the gamble to change out Asilian and maybe even taking this gamble to change out Bobski, even though I think in terms of in the server, it's the wrong move. Because you don't just sit back. While you're sitting back, someone else is recruiting the player you could have recruited and going to the level maybe you could have gone to. So I would say it's on you to recruit upgrades when you can, when it's appropriate. Kind of like EG did, trying to recruit Stanislaw instead of Daps. Okay, it didn't always work out. Some of the gamble worked out, some of it didn't, but you can see what they were going for. They were going for the top spot, and hey, they made a run at it, right? So I still don't think you couldn't have him as the coach of Vitality. Extaz has done some pretty good stuff, and I'm certainly impressed with his second squad that he's now sort of elevated without Alex, so I can't put it all on Alex's shoulders. But why can't Existence join and be part of a multi-pronged staff in that regard? I'm sure he has a very different perspective than Extaz. So I think Vitality would be a team I'd like to pick. Generally, we're talking tactical teams here. So I'll tell you what, this won't happen because it just got I'm a Pet, but I would like 100 Thieves. I mean, I think that's a squad that could use someone like him. I think if they want to go tactical again, which it seems that they don't, Ents could do it. For me, it has to be a tactical squad if you want to get the most out of Existence and have him break down demos and stuff. So I would say they're the squads that come off the top of my head as the ones that I'd like to pick. A lot of the other squads right now, you'll notice in the game, are succeeding off a looser style and raw fragging power. Nate DOGG. MMA and esports are two of the things I enjoy the most. Coincidentally, you and Robin Black are two of my favourite thinkers. Was wondering if you could share a little behind the scenes on how that chat between you came about, and do you have a favourite 30-second breakdown? I don't have a favourite 30-second breakdown, not least because most of the ones I'm remembering now are the ones that were obviously had nothing to do with MMA because it's during the quarantine. It's not a complicated question. I mean, I just followed this guy's work, saw it the last few years, thought he'd taken some big leaps up from when he was a little bit more cheesy back in the day. And so just messaged on Twitter and just said, I'd like to interview you for my side channel. Would you like to do it? I think some fans or something said yeah, this is going to be sick. Oh my God, my worlds are colliding. Those usual. And then he just got into it and we did it. So I would just say what I enjoy about him is it reminds me a little bit of Theon in League of Legends, if you've ever seen his writing. These are guys who have a real strength for creating the mental imagery around the player. These are people who've nailed the idea that you don't just describe why the guy's good or just say what you like about what he's doing. You sort of paint a picture. You use descriptors, analogies, metaphor, and you make people feel what he's good at. You see his strength. You sense what's genius about it. And even if you can't always penetrate the mystery, creating the mystery is part of what's very good about it. It's not really my strongest suit often, but it's certainly something I often put time towards trying to consider how to improve that. So I'm always impressed when people are much better than me at that regard, and I would say he's exceptional in that particular sense. Right, the other questions I will put out in another Patreon AMA later this week, and not too long from now, probably next week, there will be the next thread to collect questions for this upcoming month, because in the next day or so, they'll be billing you all, and then we can get going on another one for this month. This video was kindly supported by Alexander Rao, Bobby, Dean Tanglis, Istar, JDubs, Jensen Goh, the Puyallup Tribe, Soliko, Spencer Green, Tobias Bernasconi, Xinged, and a special thanks, as always, goes out to my main man, Jerky's Minion. Do you want to suggest a topic or a guest for my content? Maybe you want to ask me a question in those AMAs I do each month. Do you want teasers for who's going to appear next on my content? Maybe you want to take part in one of those lengthy discussions about esports with me. Well, if so, then put your money where your mouth is and join the Scrilluminati today at the Patreon link in the description box below.